Sent the obese girl to his barn as a joke. He made her owner of the entire ranch. But in the small, cruel town of Stillwater Creek, she was just the burden. A joke everyone was in on. She worked for Mr. Harrison, a bully who ran the failing Majestic Hotel. The joke started when Harrison saw a notice. The town's monster, Elias Thorne, needed help at his cursed ranch. Harrison decided to send the joke to the monster, and that's when everything changed. The joke that would shatter this miserable existence began, as most cruelties do, in a place of loud confidence and cheap whiskey. Harrison was in his usual booth at the saloon. His cronies gathered around him like flies. Tacked to the community board, stained with ale and smoke, was a fresh piece of paper. It was penned in a sharp, aggressive hand, the ink bleeding slightly into the pulp. Help wanted, Blackwood Ranch. Immediate need for a caretaker. Barn cleaning, inventory, and maintenance. Apply in person. A hush fell over the saloon. Blackwood Ranch. And its owner, Elias Thorne. Elias Thorne was not a man. He was a campfire story used to frighten children. No one had seen him in nearly a decade, not since the fire that had supposedly claimed his family and his sanity. They said he was a monster, a creature so disfigured by the flames, sight of another human being. They whispered that he shot at anyone who strayed too close to his property line, that the ranch itself was cursed, rotting away just like its owner. The notice wasn't a job offer. It was a provocation. It was proof the monster was stirring. Harrison stared at the notice. A slow, ugly smile, like a wound opening, spread across his face. He looked at his friends, then back at the paper. A caretaker, you say, he mused, his voice dripping with sudden inspiration. Someone for the barn? Someone resilient? His friends leaned in, catching the scent of his malice. Who in their right mind would go up there, Harrison? The man's a devil. Harrison tapped the notice. I know just the person. His eyes gleamed. A joke for a monster. The plan spilled out of him, perfectly formed and utterly vile. They wouldn't just suggest the job to Elara. They would force it. Harrison would play the part of the struggling businessman. The hotel was failing, he'd claim. He couldn't afford luxuries like her any longer. It was either the street or it was Blackwood Ranch. They cornered her the next morning, trapping her between the reception desk and the sagging staircase. Harrison stood in front, his two largest friends flanking him, blocking any escape. Elara, he began, his voice thick with a sickening false pity. Times are hard. I'm being forced to let you go. He held the notice out to her. But because I'm a good man, I found you something. A new position. Elara's hands trembled as she took the paper. She read the words, Blackwood Ranch. Her blood turned to ice. She'd heard the stories. Everyone had. Mr. Harrison, I can't, she whispered, the words catching in her throat. You can't? Harrison's pity evaporated, replaced by the cold steel she knew so well. Beggars can't be choosers, girl. It's this or you're out by sundown. Behind him, his friends were already snickering. The entire saloon was in on it. The wager was set. How long will the fat girl last with the monster? The town consensus was she wouldn't even make it past the front gate. Harrison himself had bet a bottle of his finest whiskey that she wouldn't last 24 hours. Elara looked at Harrison's mocking face. She looked at his friends, their eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. She looked at the peeling wallpaper, the dusty chandelier, the threadbare carpet of the prison she had lived in her entire life. Then she looked back at the notice. Elias Thorne, the monster. She didn't know what waited for her on that cursed ranch, but she knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, exactly what waited for her here. More jokes, more whispers, a life of slowly suffocating in their contempt. She straightened her back. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it was the first time in her life she hadn't tried to shrink. "Fine," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't tremble. "I'll go." She took the notice, walked past the stunned men and out the front door, leaving them in a silence that lasted only a second before it exploded into roaring, triumphant laughter. The joke was in motion. Elara didn't look back. She just walked towards the dark hills, towards the shadow of the monster, realizing, for the first time, that the true monsters were the ones who lived in the light. The journey to Blackwood Ranch was a climb into silence. The rickety carriage Harrison had generously provided rattled over a road that was little more than 2 ruts carved into the earth, disappearing into the cold, gray hills. The laughter of the saloon had faded behind her, replaced by the whip of the wind and the nervous breath of the driver, who refused to look at her, as if her bad luck were contagious. He stopped a 1/4 mile from the main gate, refusing to go further. "This is as far as I go," he muttered, tossing her small bag onto the dirt. "The monster can fetch you himself." Elara watched him turn the carriage around and flee back towards the safety of Stillwater Creek, leaving her utterly alone. She stood before the gates of Blackwood. They were wrought iron, taller than 2 men, and rusted into a filigree of orange and brown. But they were not locked. They were slightly ajar, as if inviting the world in, or perhaps daring it. She pushed one side open. The shriek of the hinges was the only sound for miles. The ranch that spread out before her was not the rotting shack of her imagination. It was vast, a sprawling domain of faded grandeur. The main house, visible in the distance, was a 3-story Victorian shadow, its windows like dark, empty eyes. Fences, once white, stretched into the mist, many of them broken and leaning. But it was the barn that held her gaze. It was colossal. It wasn't just a barn, it was a cathedral of timber, painted a deep blood red, looming against the pale sky. It looked bigger than the entire majestic hotel and 10 times as intimidating. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every story, every whisper about the devil of Blackwood swirled in her mind. She clutched the handle of her bag and forced her feet to move, one heavy step after another, across the weed-choked courtyard. The main house remained silent. The only sign of life was the barn door, which was open just a crack. She approached it, her knuckles white. She was a joke sent to a monster. What did one say? She raised a trembling hand to knock on the solid wood. "Don't bother." The voice came from the shadows inside the barn. It was deep, but not monstrous. It was rough, like gravel dragged over stone, and laced with a profound, weary bitterness. A figure stepped out of the darkness and into the sliver of light. Elara's breath caught, but not in terror. The stories had been wrong. He was not a beast, he was a man. Younger than she'd expected, perhaps not yet 30, but he was a man who had been broken and put back together incorrectly. One side of his face was a tapestry of scars, pale and silver, pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent, mournful grimace. He wore no mask, made no attempt to hide it. He stood leaning heavily on a thick cane, his left leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He looked at her, his one good eye, a piercing, intelligent blue, sweeping over her with an expression of pure, undiluted contempt. "So," Elias Thorne said, his voice quiet but sharp, "this is Harrison's latest masterpiece. He sends the town's pet project to mock the town's monster. How poetic." He limped a step closer, his gaze hardening. "The wager was 24 hours, wasn't it? That's what I heard. You can tell them they lost. You're not staying 24 seconds. Go home." He dismissed her. Just like that. He hadn't yelled, hadn't thrown anything, hadn't breathed fire. He had simply looked at her, seen the joke, and sent it back unopened. Elara felt a familiar cold shame wash over her. But then something else followed. A hot, unfamiliar spark of anger. She thought of Harrison's laughing face. She thought of the saloon, the whispers, the carriage driver fleeing. She thought of the empty, suffocating life she had just left. Go home? Home to what? To be the punchline for the rest of her days? To prove Harrison right? No. The word was out before she could stop it. It was small, barely a whisper. Elias Thorne actually recoiled, as if she had struck him. He narrowed his eye. What did you say? Elara felt the terror rising, the stutter that always claimed her when she spoke up. But the image of Harrison's sneer was stronger. She took a breath and met his gaze, forcing her eyes to stay on his scarred face, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a refusal to look away as everyone else did. I said no, she repeated, her voice stronger now, gaining power from the sheer cliff edge she was standing on. You put a notice in town. You said you needed a caretaker. I needed a worker, Elias snapped, gesturing with his cane. Not a punchline, not a child's dare. I don't participate in Harrison's games. And you think I'm part of his game? Elara's voice cracked, but with fury, not fear. You think I wanted this? He sent me here to fail. The whole town is waiting for me to come running back so they can laugh. They sent me here as a joke, Mr. Thorne. She took a step towards him, onto the threshold of the barn. If you send me back just because of how I look, just because of who sent me, then you're just part of the joke, too. You're no different than any of them. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind died. The world seemed to hold its breath. Elias Thorne stared at her, his expression unreadable. The contempt was gone, replaced by something she couldn't name. A flicker of shock, perhaps, or maybe, just maybe, recognition. He saw a fellow outcast, another creature defined by the cruelty of others. He looked at her for a long, heavy moment, his blue eyes searching her face as if seeing her for the first time. He saw the tremble in her hands, but also the defiance in her spine. He saw the tears in her eyes, but also the fact that they weren't falling. Finally, he let out a short, bitter huff that might have been a laugh in another life. He turned, his limp heavy, and pointed with his cane into the cavernous darkness of the barn. Fine, he growled. You want to work? Work. He hobbled deeper inside, disappearing into the gloom. The rules are simple, his voice echoed from the shadows. You clean the stalls first, then you start on the tack. You will find your supplies in the office. He paused, and his voice dropped, becoming deadly serious. You do not talk to me. You do not come to the main house. And you never look at my face like that again. Is that clear? Elara stood in the doorway, her heart pounding a wild, painful rhythm. She had faced the monster, and she was still standing. Yes, she whispered to the darkness. Good, his voice returned, cold as iron. Your first job is to get that carriage driver to bring your things. If he refuses, tell him I'll come down myself. That usually works. Don't leave before morning. If you're still here when the sun comes up, we'll see. The last two words hung in the air, a threat and a promise, all at once. Elara picked up her bag and stepped over the threshold, into the dust and the shadows, leaving the world that had tried to break her on the other side. The barn was a tomb. It wasn't just dirty. It was a monument to decay, a cathedral of neglect, dust thick as felt, coated every surface, hanging in the air like a shroud. Cobwebs stretched from the rafters to the floor, intricate and gray. The stalls were filled with the putrid, compacted filth of years. Broken tools, splintered wagon wheels, and rotted leather harnesses were piled in corners like broken bones. The smell was overwhelming. A sour, acidic stench of ammonia, mold, and long-dead rodents. It was a task not for a caretaker, but for an undertaker. It was a job designed to break someone, and that, Elara knew, was precisely the point. Harrison had sent her here knowing she would fail, imagining her running back to town in tears within the hour. Elias Thorne had let her stay, believing the same thing. She found a pitchfork with a cracked handle and began. The work was brutal, a physical assault. Each forkful of compacted manure was a dead weight that strained her back and screamed at her shoulders. Her hands, soft from polishing brass, were raw and blistering within the first hour. Sweat plastered her thin dress to her body, and the dust caked her face, turning to mud in the corners of her eyes. She worked with a silent, desperate fury. Every scoop of filth, every broken plank she dragged aside was not just a chore. It was an act of defiance. It was a no to Harrison. It was a no to the saloon. It was a no to the life that had tried to bury her long before she'd ever set foot in this barn. From the darkened window of the main house, Elias Thorne watched. He had watched her for hours. He had built his entire post-fire life on one solid assumption, that the world was cruel and people were weak. He expected her to weep. He expected her to sit down in defeat. He expected her to hammer on his door, begging to be taken back to town. He watched her stumble, her legs shaking with exhaustion. He watched her nearly collapse under the weight of a water bucket. But he also watched her get back up. He watched her lean against a post, her entire body shuddering, and then, after a single ragged breath, watched her lift the pitchfork and dig it back into the filth. There was no complaint, no theatrics, just a grim, relentless rhythm. He saw a resilience that mirrored his own scarred, stubborn survival. It was the first time in a decade that his certainty about the world had wavered. Elara worked until the sun had long vanished and the moon cast pale, skeletal shadows through the barn's high windows. She didn't dare stop, not even for a moment, terrified that if she paused, her body would simply refuse to start again. She worked until her vision blurred and the pitchfork felt like it was fused to her hands. Finally, her legs gave out. She didn't even make it to the small moldy cot in the tack room. She simply fell into a pile of clean straw she had laid out, her mind falling instantly into a black, dreamless void of exhaustion. When she woke, it was to the unfamiliar chill of pre-dawn. Every muscle in her body was a knot of fire. She ached in places she didn't know she had. She sat up, wincing, and that's when she saw it. Draped carefully over her sleeping form was a thick, heavy wool blanket. It was clean and smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. Beside her, on a small overturned crate, sat a tin canteen of fresh water, a bar of harsh soap, and a thick slice of dark bread with a piece of cheese. Her heart stopped. She looked around the cavernous barn, but she was alone. It was a gesture of not kindness, perhaps. Not yet. It was a gesture of acknowledgement. It was the water from the Abigail script, but it was more. It was a silent admission. You're still here. She ate the bread like a wolf, the simple food tasting better than anything she'd ever had from the Majestic's kitchen. She drank the water, and it felt like she was washing away more than just the dust. The main stalls were clean, but the job was far from over. Elias had pointed to a small leaning door at the back of the barn. The office, he had grunted. Inventory. Now she faced it. If the barn was a tomb, the office was the grave. The door hung on one hinge. The single window was opaque with grime. Inside, mold had consumed an entire wall, the plaster bubbling and black. A small desk had collapsed, its contents, piles of sodden, mildewed paper, spilled across the floor. Rats had nested in the drawers. It was a place of total despair. Elara took a breath, tied a rag over her nose and mouth, and waded in. She spent the entire day in that small, suffocating room. She shoveled out the rats' nests, scrubbed the mold from the walls, and carefully, meticulously, began sorting the piles of paperwork, laying them in the sun to dry. Most of it was useless, turning to pulp in her hands. But as the afternoon light began to fade, her fingers, raw and split, brushed against something solid, wedged beneath the rotted floorboards under the desk. She pulled. It was heavy. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger, its cover stiff and warped. But miraculously, the oiled leather had protected the pages within. She sat on the clean-swept floor, her back against the wall, and opened it. She wasn't snooping. She was just curious. The majestic hotel had taught her how to be invisible, but it had also, by sheer accident, taught her numbers. Harrison, too lazy to do his own books, would often have her tally the receipts. She'd learned to find the patterns, the small mistakes, the places where the bartenders were skimming. She found a strange, quiet comfort in the logic of numbers. They didn't lie. They didn't mock. They just were. At first, the Blackwood ledger was just a record of a failing ranch. Then her eyes snagged on an entry. An invoice for 500 bales of hay, dated just 3 months ago. She frowned. She had just cleaned the hayloft. There were perhaps 50 bales up there, all of them half-rotten. She turned the page. An order for 10 new saddles from a tannery in the city. She had just spent an hour cleaning the tack. There were 3 saddles, all of them cracked and aging. She turned again, and again. A pattern emerged, cold and clear as ice. Weekly invoices for grain that could feed a herd of 50, yet the ranch only had 3 skeletal horses. Payments for fence repairs on the north pasture, the very pasture she could see from the door, its fence collapsed and broken. But it was the signatures that made her blood run cold. She had seen Elias Thorne's signature. It was on the notice in the saloon. A sharp, angry, intelligent script. The signatures authorizing these payments were different. They were clumsy, labored, sometimes just a poorly inked X. Someone wasn't just stealing from Elias Thorne. Someone was impersonating him. Someone had been methodically, intelligently, and ruthlessly bleeding Blackwood Ranch dry for years, using its owner's isolation as the perfect cover. Her terror returned, sharp and acidic. The rules: don't talk to me, don't come to the main house. She was holding proof of a crime, a betrayal that went deeper than just money. This was the why. This was why the ranch was failing. This was why the monster stayed hidden, believing he was a failure, while someone else got rich off his ruin. She stood up, her legs shaking for a different reason now. This was bigger than her fear. This was bigger than the rules. She clutched the ledger to her chest and walked out of the barn. She didn't hesitate. She walked across the courtyard, up the sagging steps of the main house, and onto the porch. He was there, sitting in the shadows, his scarred face turned towards the setting sun. He heard her footsteps and tensed, his hand gripping his cane. "I told you," he hissed, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You do not come here." "I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne." Her voice trembled, but she did not back down. She held out the heavy book. "I found this. In the office. Under the floor." He snarled. "I don't care what trash you—" "It's not trash," Elara interrupted, her voice gaining a sudden, hard clarity. It's a lie. Someone is robbing you." He froze. The word robbing hung in the air between them. He turned his head slowly, his blue eye fixing on her with a frightening intensity. He didn't take the book. "What are you talking about?" "The invoices," she said, her words tumbling out. "The grain, the saddles. They're all fake. Someone is buying things that never arrive. The signatures. They're forgeries. Look." She opened the book to a page with a clumsy X. "This isn't you. I know it's not. Someone has been stealing from you for years, Mr. Thorne. That's why the ranch is in ruins." Elias snatched the book from her. His hand was shaking. He stared at the page, his knuckles white. He flipped to another, then another. The blood drained from his face, leaving the scars standing out in pale, stark relief. He was silent for a full minute. The only sound, the rustle of the pages, and his own ragged breathing. He wasn't just seeing the theft. He was seeing the depth of the betrayal. He was seeing the face of the real monster. Finally, he looked up. He didn't look at the book. He looked at her. The contempt was gone. The anger was gone. All that was left was a raw, stunned, and terrifyingly clear focus. He was no longer looking at the joke. He was no longer looking at the heavy girl. He was looking at the first person in a decade who had told him the truth. "Show me," he said. His voice was no longer a growl. It was a command. "Show me everything." They didn't stay on the porch. The unspoken rule, you do not come to the main house, evaporated, not with a word, but with a shared cold purpose. Elias led her, his limp heavy and fast, into the heart of his fortress. The house was like the barn, vast, dark, and suffocated by dust. They ended up in his study, a room where the furniture was still draped in white sheets like ghosts. He lit a lamp, and the small golden circle of light became their world. For hours, they sat at a massive mahogany desk, the broken ledger open between them. The barrier of his scars and her shame dissolved, replaced by the sharp, sterile language of numbers. Elara, her voice no longer trembling, but low and steady, pointed. "Here, the grain. The signature is an X. But here," she pulled a dry, brittle invoice from the office pile. "A feed receipt from 6 years ago. This is your signature. It's not even close." Elias said nothing, his scarred face a mask of stone, but his good eye was alive with a terrifying, calculated fire. The monster was gone. The master of the ranch was present. "Who?" Elias finally whispered, the words sharp. Elara's hands were shaking, but she pointed to a name at the bottom of a forged supply contract, a name listed as the liaison for all off-ranch purchases. "The Majestic Hotel," she read. "All the contracts for feed and lumber are routed through him. He must be getting a kickback." Elias slammed his fist on the desk, a sudden, violent crack that made Elara jump. "Not a kickback," he hissed. "He's the source." He stood, his cane thumping the floor. "Harrison, of course. He was my father's foreman. A bootlicker and a thief. I fired him the day my father died. He must have kept a key, forged the documents." Suddenly the joke became clear. It wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was a calculated move. Harrison had heard Elias needed help. He'd sent the obese girl not just to mock her, but to ensure that whoever was in that barn was too stupid, too scared, or too incompetent to ever look in the office. He'd sent a joke to protect a crime. He had fatally underestimated her. In a town like Stillwater Creek, silence is louder than a gunshot. Harrison's 24-hour wager had come and gone. A week had passed. The joke had not returned. The laughter in the saloon died, replaced by a nervous, confused muttering. Harrison's smug confidence began to crack, replaced by a sour, paranoid dread. She was still there, with him. What was she doing? What was she seeing? He knew better than anyone what was in that barn office. He had put it there himself, the rotting, useless trash he'd used to cover his tracks. But what if she looked? The thought was an itch he couldn't scratch. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to retrieve the proof. He had to silence the joke permanently. It happened 2 days later. Elias had ridden out to the east pasture for the first time in years, a rifle slung over his back, to check the fence lines mentioned in the ledger. Elara was alone. She was in the barn, finally mucking the last of the stalls, her mind miles away, when she heard the sound that the Stillwater Creek associated with trouble, a group of horses, ridden hard. She stepped out into the bright, cold sunlight, and her heart dropped. It was Harrison, and he'd brought his 2 largest friends from the saloon, the same men who had flanked him at the hotel. They dismounted, their spurs jingling, their faces a mixture of mockery and genuine menace. "Well, well," Harrison called out, his voice slimy with false cheer. "Look what the monster kept. You're looking ripe, Elara. Must be the country air." He sauntered closer, his eyes darting past her, scanning the barn. "We just came by to check on you. Make sure you're safe." "I'm fine," Elara said, her voice small. She instinctively moved to block the barn door. A mistake. His eyes snapped to hers, the fake smile vanishing. "Fine? You don't look fine. You look like his property. Where is he, girl? Inside the house, hiding?" He took another step, his friends spreading out, cutting off any escape. "You've been a busy girl, haven't you? Cleaning things that shouldn't be cleaned?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "We know what you found in the office, Elara. A little leather book. It's hotel property. He stole it. I'm just here to get it back." One of his men grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in. "Where is it, fat girl? Get your hands off her." The voice was not the gravelly rasp of Elias Thorne. It was a low, clear, and utterly lethal command. Harrison and his men froze. Elias was standing at the edge of the main house, not 20 yards away. He was not limping. He was standing tall, his weight evenly distributed, his scarred face impassive. In his hands he held the rifle, and it was not pointed at the sky. It was leveled directly at Harrison's chest. Harrison's face went pale. "Thorne," he stammered, his bravado evaporating, "we were just talking to the girl." "You were threatening her," Elias said, his voice calm. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. "You were trespassing, and you were touching what is mine." The words, "what is mine," hung in the air, a shield around Elara. Harrison tried to regain his footing. "She's a joke, Thorne. A half-wit we sent up here for a laugh." "She's the only honest person in your pathetic town," Elias replied, his finger resting on the trigger. "She's the new manager of Blackwood Ranch. And you are a thief." The word landed like a bullet. Harrison's face contorted with rage and fear. He knew he was beaten. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer, Harrison," Elias continued, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "You have 10 seconds to get off my property. After that, I will consider it a personal invitation to remove you myself." Harrison and his men scrambled for their horses. They didn't look back. They rode out, kicking up dust, a frantic and cowardly retreat. Elara stood shaking, her arm throbbing where the man had grabbed her. The barn, her sanctuary, suddenly felt violated. Elias didn't move until the sound of the horses was gone. He lowered the rifle, and the tension seemed to drain out of him, his legs suddenly favoring the limp again, the monster returning to the man. He walked over to her, his movements stiff. He stopped in front of her, his blue eyes searching her face, checking for damage. "He hurt you. he stated. It wasn't a question. I'm okay, she whispered, rubbing her arm. He nodded, his jaw tight with a fury that hadn't yet passed. He looked at the barn, then at her. The line between them, master and servant, monster and joke, was gone. They were something else. They were survivors. They were partners. Come inside, he said, his voice gruff. But the bitterness was gone, replaced by something else. There's more work to do. We need to find everything. She nodded and for the first time walked beside him, not behind him, up the steps to the main house. The confrontation with Harrison was a pivot. It had lanced a boil, and though the wound was still raw, the infection was draining. The immediate threat was gone, but the work, the real work, had just begun. Blackwood Ranch was no longer just a place of survival. It had become a shared battlefield. Elara was no longer a caretaker, a title that felt small and temporary. The word manager was never officially spoken, but it settled over her like a cloak she had earned. She wasn't just cleaning up the past. She was building a future. She moved out of the barn's tack room and into a small, clean bedroom in the main house, one with a window that faced the rising sun. The dust sheets in the house began to disappear, one by one, revealing the strong, beautiful bones of a home that had been asleep for a decade. Her domain became the ledger, the real one. She spent her evenings at the great mahogany desk, the lamplight illuminating her focused expression. She wasn't just tracking Harrison's theft, she was undoing it. She learned the language of the ranch, contracts for feed, the price of lumber, the cost of new seed. She began hiring new hands, a few quiet men from a neighboring county who had no loyalty to Harrison or Stillwater Creek. Elias vetted them, his one good eye reading them with an unnerving intensity, but he trusted her judgment. He watched her argue with a supplier over the price of grain, her voice steady, armed not with anger, but with an unshakable command of the facts. He saw the respect she commanded, a respect given not to her size or her past, a respect she had simply forged from pure, undeniable competence. And as Elara's presence expanded, Elias paradoxically began to emerge from the shadows he had inhabited for so long. The man who had hidden from the world, who had used his scars as a shield, was now visible. He was outside in the daylight, working alongside the new men. He was teaching Elara. He took her to the fields, crumbling the rich dark soil in his hand, explaining his father's system of crop rotation. He showed her the old bloodline charts in the study, his voice softening as he spoke of the horses his family had once bred. The bitterness that had coated every word was fading, replaced by a quiet passion, a purpose she had woken up. He was still quiet, still scarred, but the monster was in retreat. The man, Elias Thorne, was taking its place. The deepest wounds, however, were not in the ledgers or the broken fences. They were in the silence. They finally broke that silence one evening, during a storm. The rain lashed against the windows of the study, a violent drumming that seemed to shut out the rest of the world, leaving only the two of them in the lamplight. Elias had been staring into the fire, his scarred profile rigid. "He told me," Elara said softly, not looking at him, "the day he sent me here. He said he was letting me go, that I was a luxury he couldn't afford." Elias was silent for a long moment. "A luxury," he repeated, the word tasting like ash. "He has a way of turning people into objects, into burdens." He turned his face from the fire, and the shadows played across his scars, making them seem deep and raw. "The fire," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't an accident." Elara's head snapped up, her heart stopping. "It was the night I fired him," Elias continued. his voice dead, devoid of all emotion. He'd been stealing, even then. Small things. My father protected him. When I took over, I gave him his walking papers. He didn't take it well. He got drunk. He came back. He said if he couldn't have the ranch, no one could. He set the barn on fire, knowing I was inside doing the final inventory. Elara's hand flew to her mouth. He tried to kill me, Elias finished, his voice flat. He locked the door. I got out. But not before. He gestured to his face, his leg. The town believed his story, that I was careless, drunk, a grieving son who'd lost his mind, and it was easier to believe that than to believe their friend, their foreman, was a monster. So I became the monster they wanted. It was easier than being the victim. Harrison didn't just steal my ranch. His good eye glistened in the firelight. He buried me alive. The confession hung in the room, heavy and terrible. Elara felt her own past rise up to meet his, not the recent jokes, but the decades of small, quiet cruelties. I know, she whispered, and the tears she hadn't shed for herself began to fall for him. I know what it's like to be buried. He looked at her, truly seeing the shared geography of their pain. They called me Burden's girl growing up, she said, her voice thick. My aunt, after my parents died, she never let me forget that I cost her, that I took up too much space, that I was a mouth she didn't want to feed. I spent my whole life trying to earn the air I was breathing. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He just reached across the space between them, his hand scarred and rough, and laid it over hers, the one that was clenched on the desk. It wasn't a gesture of romance. It was one of alliance. It was an acknowledgement. I see you. I am you. In that moment, they were no longer a master and a manager. They were two survivors, two outcasts who had found in each other the only person in the world who spoke the same language. The ranch healed with them. The new fences were strong. The barn, once a tomb, was now loud with the sound of new life, foals with thin, unsteady legs. The main house was clean, its windows clear, letting in the light. Blackwood Ranch was not just solvent. It was becoming profitable. It was becoming a home. Elias would find himself watching her as she stood on the porch, a ledger in her hand, directing the men with a quiet, unshakable authority. He realized with a clarity that shook him that she hadn't just saved his finances. She hadn't just exposed a thief. She had walked into the grave he had dug for himself, taken his hand, and pulled him back into the world. She had saved him from the one person he couldn't fight, himself, and that he knew was a debt he could never repay. The quiet lasted for 6 months. 6 months of peace, of hard work, of watching the ranch transform from a skeleton into a living, breathing entity. The winter wheat came in, thick and golden. The foals were strong. The new hands were loyal, respectful not just of Elias, but of Madame Elara, the name they had given her, a title she still wasn't used to hearing. Elias, too, had transformed. The limp was still there, a permanent reminder, but the bitterness was gone. He still wore his scars, but he no longer hid behind them. He and Elara had built more than a business. They had built a sanctuary, a quiet, two-person world where their past could not reach them. But the past, especially in a town like Stillwater Creek, never stays buried. Harrison, facing a barrage of lawsuits from Elias's city lawyers, was a cornered rat, and a cornered rat will always go for the throat. The interruption came not as a violent attack, but as a polite, formal procession. It was a Tuesday market day. Elara was on the porch reviewing a feed bill when she saw the carriages, Not one, but three. They came up the long drive, slow and official. In the lead was Harrison, but he wasn't dressed in his usual saloon attire. He was in his Sunday best, a look of grim false piety on his face. Beside him was Mr. Davies, the banker, a small, nervous man who held the town's finances in his sweaty palms. And behind them, in the other carriages, were the elders of Stillwater Creek, the saloon owner, the sheriff, the general store proprietor. It was not a mob. It was a tribunal. Elias stepped out of the house, his face impassive, and stood beside Elara. The air crackled with a cold, formal dread. Mr. Thorne, the banker Davies began, clearing his throat and avoiding Elias's eye. We are here on an official matter. I have no business with you, Davies, Elias said, his voice flat, or with him. He nodded at Harrison. I'm afraid you do, Harrison interjected, his voice slick and practiced. He was no longer the bully. He was the concerned citizen, the savior. Elias, the town is worried about you. We've been worried for years. Your isolation, your reclusiveness. Get to the point, Harrison, Elias growled. The point, Mr. Davies said, stepping forward and shuffling his papers, is that a petition has been filed with the county court, signed by Mr. Harrison and a dozen other prominent citizens, declaring you, well, mentally unfit to manage your own estate. The words hit Elara like a physical blow. Unfit. Due to your long-term isolation and recent erratic behavior, Davies continued, his voice gaining a robotic, rehearsed quality, the court has granted a temporary injunction. Your assets are frozen pending a competency hearing. Erratic behavior? Elara spoke, her voice sharp. This ranch is profitable for the first time in a decade. What erratic behavior? Harrison turned to her, his eyes gleaming with a victory so profound, so utterly cruel that it took her breath away. He was not just here to win. He was here to destroy. He smiled, a wide, terrible smile, and pointed directly at her. You, he said, his voice ringing out for all to hear. You are the erratic behavior. He turned to the banker and the sheriff. Gentlemen, look. This is the proof of his madness. He's a recluse, a monster who has been influenced by this. He claims she's his manager. He's handed the keys to the entire Blackwood legacy to the town simpleton, a woman who, 6 months ago, was a charity case I kept out of pity. A joke. He's clearly been manipulated. He's a danger to himself, and he's allowed this burden to burrow into his life and seize control. It was his masterpiece of cruelty. In one public speech, he had erased her. She wasn't a manager. She wasn't intelligent. She wasn't a savior. She was a burden, a joke, a simpleton. He had taken all her hard-won confidence, all her success, and twisted it into the very evidence of Elias's insanity. The townsfolk murmured, nodding. It made sense to them, the monster and the fat girl. Of course, they were both crazy. Elara stood frozen, the blood roaring in her ears. This was worse than the saloon, worse than the men in the barn. This was her entire life, her entire worth, being put on trial and found guilty, all over again. And, Harrison said, delivering the final killing blow, due to the outstanding debts filed against the ranch. Those debts are fraudulent, Elias roared, taking a step forward. According to the court, Davies squeaked, they are valid until proven otherwise. And since your assets are frozen, you cannot pay them. Therefore, Mr. Harrison, as the primary creditor, has demanded satisfaction. He pulled a small gavel from his bag. I am legally bound to begin foreclosure proceedings. The auction for Blackwood Ranch, its lands and all its assets, will begin immediately. Harrison's smile was pure triumph. He had won. He would get the ranch. He would destroy Elias, and he would put Elara back in the gutter where he believed she belonged. Elias looked at Elara, his face a mask of pale, cold fury. They were trapped. The truth, their ledgers, their hard work, it meant nothing. The joke, it seemed, was on them after all. The banker, Davies, raised his gavel, his hands shaking. Per the court order, the auction for Blackwood Ranch, its lands and all assets, is now open. Harrison stepped forward, his chest puffed with triumph, his voice booming for the entire town to hear. I'll open the bidding at $5,000. A generous offer, considering the state of the management. He sneered at Elara, who stood pale and frozen. The gavel was about to fall. Stop. The word was not a shout. It was a blade. Elias Thorne stepped forward, his back straight, his limp entirely gone. He looked calm, almost amused. You cannot auction this property, Mr. Davies. Harrison spat. It's over, Thorne. You're mad. The court agrees. It's done. No, Elias said, a small, sad smile on his scarred face. The problem, Harrison, is much simpler. You can't sell my ranch. He paused, letting the words land like stones in the silent courtyard. Because it isn't mine. The silence was a vacuum. Harrison's smile froze, then cracked. What? What trick is this? Elias ignored him, turning his back on Harrison completely to face Elara. He presented a thick, folded legal document to her, his hand steady, his blue eye bright. Mr. Harrison, Elias announced, his voice carrying to the shocked crowd, you have been trespassing. You've been attempting to defraud, threaten, and steal from the legal owner of Blackwood Ranch. He tapped the paper in Elara's hand. The day she found your ledger, I had my lawyers draft a full transfer of deed. The entire estate, every acre, every animal, every dollar was legally transferred to her 6 months ago. She is the management. She is the owner. The crowd gasped as one. Elara looked from the paper to Elias and then to Harrison. The burden, the joke, was now the most powerful woman in the county. The transformation was absolute. She stepped forward, her gaze level, her voice clear and cold as iron, and pointed toward the gate. Mr. Harrison, get off my property. Harrison stood, his face a mask of disbelief, his triumph curdled into a sick gray ash. The crowd, the tribunal, the sheriff, they were all silent, staring at the woman they had called burden and joke. They were staring at the single most powerful landowner in their county. Elara's words, "Get off my property," echoed in the dead air. Harrison opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no argument. There was no trick. There was only the law, and for the first time in his life, it was not on his side. He turned, his Sunday best suddenly looking like a clown's costume, and walked not to his carriage, but past it. He walked down the long drive alone, a man who had been undone not by a monster, but by a balance sheet. The banker, Davies, and the rest of the townsfolk scrambled back into their carriages, a disorganized, humiliated retreat, leaving Elara and Elias alone on the porch, the legal document still trembling slightly in her hand. The victory was not loud. It was a vast, profound quiet. The lawsuits Harrison had filed were, of course, met with a countersuit so massive, so detailed, so ironclad with evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder that he was ruined before he ever saw a courtroom. The majestic hotel, built on stolen funds, was seized by the bank. Harrison left Stillwater Creek not with a carriage, but on foot, a fate worse than any prison in the eyes of the town. He became, in the end, what he had always tried to make Elara, a ghost, a non-person, a joke. Blackwood Ranch, under the sole ownership of Elara and the active partnership of Elias, did not just recover, it thrived. It became the beating heart of the county. The main house, once a tomb, was now filled with light and warmth. The monster and the burden had built a life that was aggressively, beautifully normal. They hired the families of the men who had once mocked them, not out of revenge, but because, as Elara often said, good work is good work. She never ruled with fear, as Harrison had. She ruled with fairness, a quality so rare it was often mistaken for weakness until one tried to cross her. Her authority was never questioned because it was never flaunted. It simply was. Elias found a peace he never thought possible. The scars on his face remained, but they were no longer the definition of his existence. They were just his face. He found he could ride into town to buy supplies and meet the eyes of the townsfolk, not with anger, but with a quiet indifference that was more powerful than any threat. They no longer saw a monster. They saw the man who stood beside Madame Thorne. The two were rarely seen apart, a silent, unshakable unit. They were partners in every sense of the word, two halves of a whole, bound not by romance, but by something far stronger, a shared survival, a mutual, profound respect. They had both been to the grave, and they had pulled each other out. Elara herself, she had not just changed, she had been revealed. The quiet, capable, intelligent woman had been there all along, buried under the weight of other people's cruelty. She had just needed a place to stand. She still loved the logic of numbers, the quiet satisfaction of a balanced ledger. She still preferred the company of the horses to the chatter of the town, but she was no longer invisible. When she walked onto the porch of her house, looking out over her land, the land she had saved, she stood tall. She took up space, and she finally felt, after a lifetime of feeling like a guest, that she had earned the very air she was breathing. The ranch was her proof, carved in timber and soil, that she was, and always had been, more than enough. They had sent her as a joke, a piece of disposable cruelty, a way to protect a lie. They thought they were throwing a stone, but they had planted a seed. They had sent a burden to a monster, hoping they would destroy each other. And in a way, they had. The monster was destroyed, leaving the man. The burden was destroyed, leaving the owner. Together, they had built a fortress, not of stone, but of competence and shared trust, and in doing so, had proven that the ugliest, most broken things in the world can often build the most beautiful. Thank you for coming this far with us on this journey. A story like this, it makes you wonder about the labels we're given and the ones we accept. I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your city and state in the comments below. Are you from a small town like Stillwater Creek or a big city where the jokes are just a different kind? I read every single comment, and I love hearing your stories. And if you enjoyed watching Elara's world change, please hit that subscribe button. We have so many more stories to tell.